Welcome, everybody, to a new episode of the new Lyre podcast. I'm your host, David Goslin, and I'm here with yet another fascinating guest, Carey Jobe. Carey, welcome to the show.
Glad to be here, David. Happy Groundhog's Day.
Happy Groundhog Day. Is it Groundhog Day?
February 2nd, yes.
Okay, I mean, it's very cold here, so I don't know what the groundhogs are doing out at this time, but I guess where you are, it's actually pretty decent, right? You're down in Florida?
I don't see any, but if there are any, I imagine they're frolicking.
Yeah, they're having a nice time, aren't they? So yeah, we brought you onto the show, Carey. You've been up to some very, very interesting things. You recently have been on a project reconstructing classical Greek tragedies. You've been writing, as you were telling me, publishing on and off for decades now. You recently retired as a judge down in Florida. Is that right?
I was a judge in Tennessee. I've moved to Florida since I retired.
Okay, all right. So living the life down in Florida. That's great. Amen.
Absolutely.
So yeah, we thought we'd get you on here to just discuss some of the things that you've been up to, and we can probably get into the fascinating work you've done on Greek tragedy and why what drew you to that. Your formal bio reads, Carey Jobe is a retired attorney and judge. Prior to beginning his legal career, he was a student of classical literature and Latin language. His Latin translations have appeared in the Classical Outlook, the Journal of the American Classical Society. He is also a widely published poet whose work regularly appears in numerous literary journals. He lives and writes near Tallahassee, Florida. So I guess, I mean, just to start, what got you, you decided to be a judge. You studied, prior to your legal career, though, he was studying a student of classical literature. So I get the impression, like many, I mean, I've spoken with my friend Adam Seedy, and he's pointed out how there are a lot of lawyers and people in the legal world who seem to have a passion for literature, but naturally, literature isn't always the safest bet as far as career choices go. And so a lot of people, though, with a genuine passion for arts and letters seem to, make that shift into the legal world. But luckily, not all of them lose their passion, and some actually come back and pretty strong, right? So in the recent years, you've been writing, I think, a lot of poetry, right? And you've been doing these reconstructions of classical Greek tragedy. So maybe just tell us a bit about your early, the beginning of your journey, how you got into literature, and yeah, why? What drew you to the classics?
All right. Well, I was born in a very small town in East Tennessee. Um, Not much in the way of culture in my surroundings. My father ran a grocery store, and my mother was a teacher. Um, but my mother loved books, and through her, I was constantly exposed to books during my childhood. And I started reading as soon as I could. Uh, as soon as I was about six or so and learned to read, I asked my parents if they would buy me a set of encyclopedias, which I guess was overly ambitious for a 6-year-old. But I wanted to go through the books and learn all that I could. I've always enjoyed reading. I suppose I've been a bit of a loner. I was a loner in my childhood because I enjoyed reading, I think, more than getting out and playing baseball with the other kids. So I read from an early age, all I could. I was especially interested in history. That's how I was first aware of the Greeks through reading about Greek history. Um, and that's pretty much how I continued my childhood. until around maybe 16 or 17 or so. That's when I discovered poetry for the first time. In fact, that seems to be the usual age when people report that they discover poetry. There's that moment of awakening sometime in the teenage years when young children get a sense of themselves as individuals, and poetry facilitates that transition. So in my case, I discovered John Keats, and reading Keats was like a revelation for me. I think Keats is probably the ideal poet for someone growing up and discovering themselves and discovering the world, because his poetry is about self-discovery, discovering the beauty of the world, the beauty of love, just opening one's eyes and seeing the world. So Keats led me to poetry, and became my poet for a number of years. But it did branch out from then. When I graduated from high school, one of my relatives asked me what gift I wanted as a graduation present. And I stunned them a bit. I said I wanted a complete set of Shakespeare, just a one-volume set of all Shakespeare's plays. So from Keats, I went on to Shakespeare, read Shakespeare as much as I could. I guess with growing understanding, you can't really absorb all of Shakespeare's depths at a very early age, but if you keep trying, it does broaden. Um, and from Shakespeare, I made a very important poetic discovery: the poetry of Robert Frost. And Robert Frost uh, became my favorite poet at that stage. What I learned from Frost was that you can find wisdom in commonplace experiences, and you can convey that insight through commonplace language, through the language of ordinary people. Poetry isn't something lofty that's up on some high mountain. It's all around us. And we can find poetry in our day to day experiences. And we don't need to have an elevated vocabulary to express it. We can express it in the normal conversational speech that we use every day.
Mm.
So, so I did discover Frost, and he was a very important influence on my poetry. Mm-hmm. Now, I just want to mention one other thing. I did have a middle class background, and coming with that was a sense of practicality. I was wise enough to know that poets have a tough time making a living. And so that's what led me into law, because law involves the use of language, linguistic skills, rhetorical skills, the same skills that a poet strives for. So I decided to go into law just because I needed to have a profession, and I felt that I could contribute something in the legal field and earn a living, and
Right.
still keep my interest in poetry. So that's why I went into law school.
Right. Well, that
Uh,
seems to make sense then. That's why, I mean, because you always get the stories, right, of people who had the passion and then it fizzles out, they sort of get worn down by, you know, all the exigencies of life, responsibilities, family responsibilities, and all that. But again, that's not necessary. There's no reason to lose that fire, and that's what's interesting. We have quite a few people that they never lost the fire. I think one thing that did happen though that is worth noting is that the poetry that we like, the art that we like and find inspiring, which I'd say is, I mean, the most inspiring kind of art, classical art. It wasn't actually, that popular for a while, right? I mean, the classics never went away, but as far as the world of contemporary literature and what people were expected to produce, if they wanted to be serious artists, classical verse, rhyming poetry, and the kind of thing we'd associate with, say, a Keats or the classical Greeks, that wasn't exactly uh, in mode, right? So, yet, all the more, it's important that some people, or people all everywhere sort of managed to preserve that passion in one way or another, where today we are seeing a resurgence of classical verse, traditional verse, in order to express, timeless ideas and emotions today, within our own unique age.
Hmm.
So I guess we're lucky now that things, the tide is turning and there is an interest in exactly the kind of thing that we have always been drawn to, and that, I mean, mankind has always been drawn to, but for some reason, for a while, we were told, poetry doesn't work that way anymore. Art has moved on, and, you have to do something new. You have to do something different. Did you ever run into that? Or, I mean, how did you?
Well, like we've discussed, I started writing poetry in the '70s, not the '70s, and I wrote a lot of poetry in the 1980s. And the poetry world was quite different back then from what it was now. There were just a handful of outlets that published what's called traditional poetry, meter, rhyme, those sorts of devices. But most poetry was free verse in the '80s. And if I wanted to be seriously considered by a wide range of journals, basically I had to discard the techniques that I felt were important for poetry and basically write loosely metered verse. I never got into completely free verse, but I wrote loosely metered verse during the '80s for a long time. I did write some formal poetry, and there were just a handful of outlets then that accepted it. Plains Poetry Journal was one of those. The Lyrica was another. But for the most part, I had to adhere to the conventions of the time to get a hearing. And thankfully, that's changed now. I do see a lot of increase in interest and enthusiasm for what I consider traditional poetry. Um, I think that there was a big mistake in the poetic world. I guess in the early 20th century, um, the poets at that time grew tired of tradition, but instead of reinvigorating tradition and renewing it, they discarded it. And in discarding it, they didn't have an adequate substitute. And and I think that affected poetry for many, many years. Thankfully, I think we're moving away from that mindset, and I feel that's a good thing.
Absolutely. And I mean, yeah, like you said, engaging the tradition, and we'll be able to explore that in a few different ways because you have taken on this wonderful project where, you've been looking at lost tragedies, right? The remaining fragments of different tragedies, like Aeschylus's Prometheus trilogy or duology, depending on what your verdict is on that. Philoctetes, right? There are so many tragedies have been lost to the sands of time, but all the more the fact that we do have fragments peppered a bit everywhere in the writings of critics, right, of ancient critics, of ancient rhetoricians and others who cite various passages. It's quite fascinating that we actually, in a sense, we may know more than we think in terms of what's possible when it comes to imagining how these lost tragedies would have been composed. And that feels quite special, right? It's like, I think about it like hieroglyphics, discovering the meaning or use for certain hieroglyphics that had otherwise, like Campoleon's famous Rosetta Stone, right? There's a bit of that feeling when it comes to reading your reconstruction of the tragedies. And I mean, yeah, we'll be able to say there's all sorts of things I think one could observe about how the Greeks engaged, the classical Greeks engaged with their traditions, right? Because you had very different tragedians, right? Aeschylus was not the same as Sophocles. Sophocles was not the same as Euripides. But in the same way that we can engage a poetic tradition with verse and rhyme, where verse, rhyme, and meter sort of create constraints for us to work within and sort of create, uh, resolve certain problems, or make original sort of discover new original wordings and poetic expressions, because there are these constraints that sort of force the mind to come up with something new. Same way with these Greek tragedies, you have the playwrights working within the constraints of a particular story, but then doing their own thing with it, which I feel is a tradition that is very fruitful and something worth rediscovering today. So your reconstruction of Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound, the Philoctetes myth and how that was treated by Sophocles, Euripides, Aeschylus, I feel that gives us a good sense of that. And just overall, there's an enthusiasm that's kindled by rediscovering these lost tragedies. So maybe, yeah, tell us a bit about that project, right? I feel like there might be more down the line, but you've written two great essays. Your Aeschylus piece, Reconstructing, the Prometheus Unbound of Aeschylus, rebuilding a lost masterpiece, is one of the top 10 articles over at Antagon, a forum for classics. It was one of their top 10 most read articles in 2024. It's very impressive. So maybe tell us a bit about this classical Greek tragedy reconstruction project you have going.
Um, the three great tragedians, Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides, between them wrote almost 300 plays. We have the names of their plays, so we can come up with a total, and it's somewhere between 250 and 300. Of those, only 34, approximately 34, have survived in full. There are fragments of others. We've found papyrus fragments at a place called Oxyrhynchus in Egypt that is filled out that number, but only 34 complete tragedies exist. And that always bothered me. I loved reading the plays that we have. I've read all of them, but I ended with a feeling that I wanted more. I couldn't get enough of it, basically. And I looked over these fragments that we had, and I took the attitude of someone working a crossword puzzle, I guess, or maybe putting mosaic pieces together. I saw patterns in the fragments, and I thought, well, there's enough here to complete the story, to get at what the playwright was aiming for there. And I thought this is an important missing part of the classical tradition. For instance, you mentioned the Prometheus play that we have, Prometheus Bound. Um, it ends on an unresolved note. Um, uh, Zeus is punishing Prometheus for stealing fire. He's chained him to a rock high up in the Caucasus Mountains. In the play, Hermes demands that Prometheus reveal a secret that he's indicated that he has. He knows how Zeus will have a downfall, and Prometheus refuses to tell. And so, as punishment, Zeus plunges Prometheus into a whirlwind, and that's how the play ends. It ends with brute force getting the upper hand over wisdom and insight. Prometheus means foresight. And so that seemed like a dissonance that I wanted to resolve. And so I looked at the fragments of the sequel play, Prometheus Unbound, and it seemed to me that the action of the sequel play resolved the dissonances that were in the preceding play, that there was a reconciliation between wisdom and brute force
Hmm.
into a third harmonious force. And I wanted to aim at that in my reconstruction of the play. Um, now, I when I was in college, I want to mention this. I carefully avoided becoming a classics major. I took a lot of classics courses. I had a lot of pressure to be a classics major and go on and pursue an academic career, and I avoided that. So I have avoided becoming a scholar. I'm just a poet looking at these fragments like a poet. So I'm not bound by the scholarly or academic method of 2 plus 2 equals 4, and let's not go beyond 4. I can use my poetic insights to kind of get a feeling for how the play would progress, to cover those huge gaps in the fragments that were missing. And so in the case of Prometheus, I had an intuitive sense that the play was headed in a certain direction. And the fragments did not contradict my intuition. And so I reconstructed the play on that basis, that eventually, through the operation of higher cosmic forces, Zeus comes to a recognition that brute force will eventually encounter its downfall. And Prometheus comes to an insight that wisdom without force as its ally is powerless. And so the two eventually come to a reconciliation. And I believe that that's what happened in the subsequent play, and reconstructed the play to try to bring that idea to fruition. And that's what I did with the case of the Prometheus fragments.
Right. No, that's very fascinating. I mean, if we just had to give one example of an, I guess, well, you just gave one in terms of how the dissonance was resolved. But like, for example, in the essay, um, what you're alerting to in terms of the reconciliation, there's a fragment, it says that great idea is underscored in a final quotation attributed to Unbound. Words probably sung by the chorus, you say, in the celebratory conclusion of this lost play. So you surmise that it reads, when strength links arms with justice, what mightier pair than this? And so you surmise that this would belong to the final chorus of the Unbound.
Correct. It's interesting to note that the chorus, these Greek tragedies always had a chorus with them. The chorus, we know as a fact that the chorus of the Prometheus Unbound, the lost play, was the Titans. The Titans that Zeus had banished into Tartarus after the battle with the Titans called the Titanomachy.
Mhm.
And at the beginning of the Prometheus Unbound, the Titans have been freed. That's set forth at the beginning of the play, according to our ancient sources. So the tone and theme of reconciliation was set forth at the very outset of the play. The Titans have been freed from Tartarus, and they have come to the Caucasus Mountains to visit Prometheus and to counsel him. So at the very outset of the play, there's an example of the reconciliation that takes place during the course of the play.
Hmm. I mean, you know what's going to happen here? I'm gonna start I'm gonna use this to start asking you more questions about these lost tragedies, or what we, I guess for me, because I'm not a classical or I didn't study classical Greek or Latin in school, so I have a bit less freedom in terms of getting answers. And yet, just like you, I've always been deeply bothered by all these lost tragedies, or just the fact that we only have mostly fragments, for instance, of Sappho. There's just something tragic about that, but all the more, right, getting into what do we actually know, what can we maybe intuit, and again, given we're not scholars and given we are, you know, using a license of insight, which I mean, what is scholarship without some insight, right?
Exactly.
Um, it's quite liberating and exciting. So I mean, I was just wondering though, for the Titans, are they freed in every you know version of history in the classical Greek lore, or
Um,
are they usually just downcast?
well, by way of background, as as you know, Zeus attained mastery of Olympus by overthrowing his father Saturn.
Right.
Uh, Chronos in the Greek name nomenclature. The Titans fought Zeus on behalf of Saturn during that contest to overthrow Chronos. And so when Zeus was victorious, and I should mention he was victorious with the aid of Prometheus. But Prometheus,
Right.
who is a Titan himself, he switched sides and aided Zeus. So Zeus overthrew Kronos and the Titans. Uh, Kronos was banished, and the Titans were banished. But at the start of the Prometheus Unbound, the Lost Play, Zeus has amazingly set the Titans free from Tartarus. He has pardoned them and released them. And so they appear before Prometheus to say, in effect, a reconciliation is possible. Maybe you should soften your stance of unremitting defiance and try to reach an accommodation with Zeus for cosmic harmony.
Right. And it also makes me just think, right? Because I mean, we do tend to idealize the classical Greek world, but, there was a lot of tragedy in the classical Greek world. It wasn't really that ideal, at least when it comes down to, geopolitics and, all sorts of power struggles. And so this idea of reconciliation, though, right? We think of the history, the lore of Troy, right? And the battle between the Greeks and the Trojans, which ultimately, I mean, history suggests that, there was a dark age after the fall of Troy. And basically, it was an endless war, right? It was the kind of quagmire that we see modern nations have gotten themselves into. The U.S. has been, uh, entangled in all sorts of foreign wars that have really just, created a mess in more than one respect. But so all the more, I find that fascinating, the role of a playwright, right, in the ancient world, like Aeschylus, where you do have this question of reconciliation, which I mean, it doesn't, you know, instinctually, it doesn't sound like Zeus is that much of a reconciling guy, or but all the more, right, that that enmity is what is sort of is just creating an endless cycle of destruction. And so we see in the existing trilogy, right, that we do have from Aeschylus, the Arrested trilogy. It's really about reconciliation, right, with the Furies, the Eumenides becoming the Furies become the Eumenides, or what the Eumenides become, they change their name.
On a practical note, Zeus had a practical reason for reconciling. Maybe he wasn't 100% in the magnanimous vein. Prometheus knew how Zeus would fall from power, and
Right.
he refused to tell. Um, and so you
Right.
you got to think. But Zeus says, "Well, I mean, we need to reconcile, and once we do that, maybe he'll tell me." And
Right.
that's what ultimately happened. For those who might not know that part of the story, Zeus was enamored of the nymph Thetis, and Thetis was destined And that brings in the idea of destiny as a power higher even than Zeus. Thetis was destined to give birth to a son who would be greater than his father.
Right.
So if Zeus pursued that to the conclusion in an amorous way, he would have been overthrown by Thetis's son. So
Who
once
is
he,
who is
go ahead.
Hercules?
Mm-hmm. True. Yeah. Thetis ultimately was married to the mortal Peleus and gave birth to Achilles, who was great, who was one of the greatest heroes, if not the greatest, in Greek mythology. Um, and so that's how the situation was resolved, and it was because I think in the play, Prometheus reveals to Zeus that destiny, and so he warned Zeus not to have a child by Thetis, or he would be overthrown. So I think that was part of the plot of the play.
Right. I mean, so an importance of insight, right? We're talking about insight, whether it's in reconstructing Greek tragedies or, making the right political calculation. I mean, the consequences of a lack of insight, I guess, are just that, are tragedy, right? I mean, that's arguably one of the, you know, reasons there was an emphasis on the art form, right? On tragic art forms was because they were crucial to developing the insight, right, in people. Like, how else are you going to develop it, right? At the end of the day, if we think about it, how does one develop insight? I mean, you can have a lot of bad experiences and maybe, you could call that wisdom after a while or just experience, such that not to fly too close to the sun or something. But then is that really a viable uh, approach, right? If you don't want, say, your child or your nation or a society to learn the hard way, which may mean, that society doesn't last very long, there has to be some way of inculcating people with some kind of power to foresee the consequences of their actions. And
And
it
and
seems,
David, I was going to say that was the whole thrust of Greek tragedy. Um, the Greek tragedians were trying to present characters on the stage who had some fatal flaw that led ultimately to their downfall. And the intent was that the audience, by seeing a noble character meet his downfall due to some unforeseen mistake or flaw in character, that would have an educational effect on the audience. Aristotle wrote quite a bit about that effect of tragedy in his Poetics. The tragedy was ideally supposed to produce a catharsis in the audience. Um, I guess you could term it a sense of feeling, hey, this could happen to me too if I'm not careful, if I don't live a good, worthy, moral life. This that I'm seeing on stage could happen to me as well. And so the tragedians were trying to be teachers, and to try to lead their audience into leading more moral, ethical lives, to be better citizens. It had an educational purpose. That was a very important part of Greek tragedy.
right. And what's stunning, though, is they took it so far, right, in terms of the organization of the choruses, right, the singing and the dancing. It really, in a sense, it became a spiritual institution, right? It was sort of, it was the lifeblood of the Greek culture, in a sense, was sort of organized around that, which is fascinating. And I mean, just contrasting that with today, right? I don't know that the tragic art form has thrived as much in our days, and maybe that's at least, even on a clinical level, that's somewhat interesting. No, that why don't we have great tragedies? What does that say about a culture that doesn't really value tragic art in the same way. And yeah,
Yeah. One important thing about Greek tragedy is it was part of a great religious festival, um, the Greater Dionysia Festival, which took place every year in Athens. And the entire society took part in it. It was a huge festival in honor of Dionysus. I guess bigger even than Mardi Gras. It, everything shut down in Athens. Everyone was out in the streets singing songs, carousing, celebrating. And the culmination of that festival, which took place over many days, the culmination was the tragic competition. Um, the competition was three sets of four plays by three playwrights, a competition, and it took place over probably 3 days. Each playwright had to produce four plays, three tragedies, and then to lighten the mood after three tragedies, a satyr play. So they were performed in the Theater of Dionysus at the foot of the Acropolis, each of three consecutive days. It was a competition. There was a winner declared, and all of the population, probably or almost all of the population attended. I read that the Theater of Dionysus had a capacity of maybe 30,000, which was pretty much the population of the male population of Athens at that time. We think that the audience was primarily males, uh, and it was considered almost a civic duty to attend the theater. Um, the playwrights were attempting to teach the citizens about questions of justice, revenge, love, making correct moral choices. And citizens were not required by law, but pretty much expected to participate and to think about those issues because it made them better citizens. And there was just a sort of a mass involvement in theater and poetry generally at that time that we are lacking today, as you point out.
right. And again, it's not like everything was perfect in terms of it seems they got that down. Right, right. Like if we think about the political institutions in ancient Greece and just the way, I mean, in some sense, nothing new under the sun. The way wars were sort of decided, and that was the Peloponnesian War, and all that was awfully disastrous. I mean, as I was, observing with a friend not that long ago. I mean, if you look at Athens or ancient Greece at like, the first century AD, I mean, there was not much going on. Like it had been hollowed out, right, due to war, economic, and all sorts of social upheavals. But that being said, I think the whole point of progress, a renaissance today, if we're thinking about these things, means taking the best, right? Learning from the best and taking the best aspects of a culture or age and finding out how to, apply that to our own time and context. So, yeah, I think that's one of the stunning things about the Greeks, right? Is they got the art, uh, they got that down so well, and yeah, it's interesting to imagine, what's possible today, right? Naturally, we have this film television, well, film, we'll say, the movie screens, and there's definitely a lot of potential there. At the same time, it's also more limited, right? There are certain things you can it's different, right? It's similar, and yet it feels like there's a whole different world of potential there. But I don't see why Shakespeare, had he been around today, would he really be just writing plays, or would he be writing some screenplays? It's an interesting thought
Well,
experiment.
musically speaking, the great the greatest creativity in music today seems to be in film scores.
Right. Yeah, no, I mean it's so in that sense, I mean I think learning from the best of I don't see why the principles of classical Greek tragedy can't lead to great contemporary tragedies. I don't know that we I don't know, maybe we do, right? I don't want to poo-poo but is there not a difference, or is it not useful to maybe draw a distinction between, we do have dramas today, but do they have the same classical tragic quality, or what is that, right? What is that classical Greek quality of tragedy, and can that be applied today? If so, like, what does it come down to versus, I mean, the kind of dramas maybe that we have today? Is that a fair
Yeah,
question? I don't know.
uh, I'm not sure I know the answer to that question,
We're we're we're,
but
we're thinking out loud here.
yeah, Greek tragedy was part of a religious festival, like I said, and the playwrights actually took on the role of almost priests. Um, they they explained the ways of God to the common man in a way that they could understand as a way to guide them in their daily lives. Um, Now, for that to have any widespread effect, it has to be society wide. You can't just write for a small elite of people. And for whatever reason, I think that that's actually what's going on today. There's only a small minority that seems to be artistically attuned. I wish that weren't the case, and maybe there are signs that appreciation for the arts is becoming more and more widespread among the general populace. But at some point or other, it seems like poetry, drama, the arts in general started to be written for a small group of people, not for the population as a whole. And I think that that was a wrong fork in the road for the arts.
Right. And I mean, it brings a lot of paradoxes to the fore, but also that I arguably there was art for the masses, right? Or there is art for the quote unquote masses. Not that I like to use that word, but the focus was on entertainment, right? When we talk about mass culture, pop culture, commercialized culture, and it lost its moral impetus, which clearly the classical Greek tragedy had. So already there, right? I mean, if you take morality out of it, which I think did happen, right, with art, like it was pretentious, right? If you were erudite, you weren't trying to convey some high, lofty moral lesson or present some great moral paradox, so much as you were looking to, when we look at these Hollywood films, a lot of it is yeah, it doesn't seem like that's the goal. And I mean, so the idea that morality plays a role in the composition of great art, especially tragedy, right, which has, one would like to think, an unavoidable moral dimension. If that's not, if the artists, if the composers themselves of modern works aren't facing that within themselves, right? Because they think that's not what contemporary art's about, then it makes sense that you know, there's going to be a deficit of certain qualities in the art.
And
I
there's
see that as humbling, right? If you need morality to a certain degree, if you're going to compose the kind of works that we in our age that we saw in ancient Greece at the high point of its classical culture.
You mentioned by the first century, the Greek cultural energy had pretty much hollowed out. You can blame the Romans if you want for that. That the Romans did not have the intense fascination with tragedy as an educational force that the Greeks did. They were more interested in the arts as entertainment. You could think of the Colosseum, the games in the Colosseum, breads and circuses. So it could be that this trait has always been with us. This trait is to lead the arts into entertainment rather than as a moral uplifting force. It's been with us, I guess, innately ever since man existed, but I can see the beginnings of it for our culture as far back as the Romans. I don't think it's anything new.
Right. And at the same time, I will say that I had an interesting conversation. I was doing extra work sometime during the summer where we were on a film set and for a big Hollywood movie, big actors and stuff. And I was just you get a lot of like film school kids and all sorts of artsy types. But one was making some there's a lot of chatting, right? Half the time you're just standing around, so everybody's kind of chatting. It's kind of like high school in a funny way. But everybody's kind of artsy extroverts of some kind.
Mm-hmm.
And he was just saying though that there's a change in the film world today where number one, before the emphasis was on realism, right? Like everything had to be realistic, fantasy, and these things were not as encouraged. Um, and he was saying today what young people are interested in is aesthetics, how an artist treats a theme aesthetically, right? Doesn't matter if it's realistic or not, right? It could be total fantasy or something. I mean, we see that with like Dune, right? The last the second uh Dune movie that came out recently. Uh, it's an epic, number one, so it does have echoes of that classical genre, but it's aesthetically quite it's fascinating. So that's actually considered a better measure of the artist and his abilities is his aesthetical taste and treatment versus just whether the drama sounds, convincing or if the characters, if they're saying things that you think you would, you could expect to hear on the street or something, or, a couple having an argument or something, did it sound realistic or not? So that's a change where aesthetics is becoming a lot more important. But the second point he made was that a lot of people are flocking to films to learn something. People want to be challenged now with the movies that they watch. And I did notice that in even just random conversations that I heard younger people having about films. And I was actually surprised by the commentary and the responses because they were discussing the dialogue and what it meant and if it was good or not. Um, so that kid on the bus that I spoke to seemed to have some pretty real insights on the film front, and that seems to apply to one surmises art in general today. I mean, we see it with our submissions and stuff. Like poetry is a place I would like to think where we go to be challenged, right? Poetry often emerges uh, in times of crisis, right? A crisis sort of invites or demands poetry, right? And I don't know that that um, that much. That's really hyperbole if we think of like Dante, right? When did he write the Divine Comedy? He wrote it when Europe was in a total mess. Europe was wallowing in just sheer madness, corruption. Homer, right? What was the impetus for Homer writing the Iliads and Odyssey, and probably a lot of the lost cycles, right? Whether written by Homer or others. I mean, they were recounting this story that people had probably even lost the ability to really convey in language or remember of what happened between the catastrophe that was the Trojan War, so that people could sort of get acquainted with again actions have consequences, right? What are the nature of different characters and their flaws, and what does that look like when it's played out, such that, maybe we could hear the story or see that thing played out on the stage rather than become the latest living incarnation of that principle, of that tragic principle. So yeah, it does seem like there is a shift. Kid on the bus made good observations about that. We see it, and it makes sense, doesn't it? I mean, does it not? Like, where else are we going to go if not the world of art, and tragedy for this? I mean, there are other things that do that. A good sermon will do that. But again, a nice essay can do that, but art is
Uh,
very visceral. I guess that's where one of the differences. It's performative and it has a visceral dimension that perhaps isn't really like nothing else has. And so,
right. David, what you're describing for me goes back to the very origin of poetry. I mean, why did people back in the Stone Age first write poetry? Um, because they wanted the world to be explained to them. They didn't understand why the sun rose in the morning and set in the evening, why people grew old and died. Poetry almost served a religious function. Maybe back in the original days, maybe it was intertwined with religion, with shamans uh, 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 telling people why they were alive, what they were
right,
supposed to do, and people still have that recurrent need. Tell me, somebody explain to me why this is happening, why there's war, why there's injustice. There's a constant need to understand this. And maybe that need is being answered more and more by drama, by poetry, by the arts in general. But that's a recurring need in human nature, I think.
right. And I mean, all the more why I think it's exciting to see people taking poetry and the art form seriously again. So, I mean, yeah, I would like, it would be interesting to see who's going to come up with what a new tragedy would look like in our age. I mean, have you run into any I think there are some people, right? I don't want to poo-poo that. I mean, for all I know, there's great tragedies being written right now.
Um, Personally, I'm not aware of any, but I'm living sort of isolated.
Right. But I mean, yeah, it's even eh, I don't know that I don't think we can you know feel I doubt there's
There are unappreciated tragedies in the Western tradition that need revival. For instance, how many people do you know who have read Boris Godunov by Pushkin? Uh,
right. Right. I haven't. I know I should. I mean, I know that yeah, I mean, the world of Russian literature is something that I haven't had a time to explore yet, but I know it's there. And yeah, I mean, all the more though, the probably the best place to start. That's why I think what you're doing with these tragedy reconstructions is so crucial because the place to start, right, is to get back in touch with that spark, right, of the ancients, and reconstructing lost tragedies seems like a brilliant um it's not a shortcut, but way to foster that enthusiasm again. So I mean,
exactly.
maybe tell us about another one. I mean, I have a question for you actually. I mean, maybe some people find this interesting as well, but because you talked about Keats, have you read Keats's Hyperion?
Oh yes, both versions. Mhm.
Right. So he treats the Titanomachia, right?
Right. Yes, he goes at length about Saturn, and Hyperion, of course, was one of the Titans.
Right. And what do you think is maybe we can we're going by memory here. Yeah, I didn't mention I was gonna ask you about this before, but yeah, I mean, it's a fascinating, I've always loved, I was always very inspired by Keats's Hyperion. Byron, who had, uh, said all sorts of unkind things about Keats, said that Hyperion read like Aeschylus. He said it was truly a sublime work. And so Keats, he did two versions of it. He did one as a dream, I believe, to as a shortened version to try and wrap everything up. But
That was the second version.
yeah, so I don't know that he was fully satisfied. Did it ever really conclude? Did Keats ever? Because I guess that would, I think, be the closest thing to um the ancient world of classical Greek drama in terms of the next best approximation. I would argue I prefer it over Shelley's Prometheus Unbound, though it's interesting. But did it ever really conclude? Like Keats died, did he get to finish it the way he wanted to? And
He never finished it. It was left a fragment at his death. Now it was included in Keats' last volume of poetry, the one that was published just months before his death. But the editors put a footnote stating that Keats objected to the Hyperion fragment being included in his volume of poetry simply because it was incomplete, and the editors persuaded him to allow it to be published due to its obvious high literary merit.
right.
So the first fragment is the one that's in Keats' final volume of poetry. Mm-hmm.
And maybe could you tell us, even if we're going by memory here, so what's the basic plot with that one? Like, what does Keats bring maybe that stood out to you as different, or his own personal unique treatment of the Titan lore? Like,
Um, I think that Keats' model was not so much Aeschylus as it was Homer, um, through the filter of John Milton. I think that Paradise Lost was high in Keats' mind when he wrote the Hyperion fragment. He wanted to emulate that high epic tone that Milton used in Paradise Lost, and that Homer had used, of course, and Virgil also in Latin. He was trying to write an epic rather than a drama. Um, Keats' one effort at drama was kind of a historical play about the Middle Ages, Otho the Great. It was based more on Shakespeare than on the Greek tragedians, but the Hyperion fragment was basically an epic story.
and yeah, what's the? I always found that I couldn't fully, at least from what I remember, figure out though what Hyperion represented. I guess
He
what Keats
represented
was
the
going
old
for.
order, the old order. Think back to when we were talking about uh, Zeus' battle with Kronos and the
Yeah,
Titanochemy, the battle with the Titans. In Hyperion, Kronos, Saturn, to the Romans, is overthrown, and Hyperion is one of the Titans who is hoping to organize a rebellion to overthrow Zeus and
right,
regain the throne for Saturn.
right. And I mean, so yeah, the metaphorical richness though, in what was Keats trying to get at in terms of what was the order, who were the Zeusians of his age, maybe that he was thinking the Titans needed to, you know, come together and overthrow. Because he was taking the poetry world, or the literary establishment of that age to task, right? I mean, he wasn't exactly loved or celebrated or popular by all the top literary voices of his age, right? They were, the magazines, the Blackwoods, the Edinburgh Review, these guys were all, dunking on him.
Yeah,
Cockney drivel, right? Is what they.
exactly. Yeah, he Keats apparently felt that his age needed an epic. It needed a long poem in the epic vein. because nobody else was writing serious epics at that time. I guess the closest thing to an epic long poem would be Byron's Don Juan, but that's it's really a satirical poem, Don Juan by Byron.
Right, and Keats did not like it. I mean, it was well written, but it was exactly its lack of, you know, moral fortitude of any kind that had offended Keats. I remember there's a famous passage. I don't know if you have you ever read Andrew Motion's biography of John Keats?
No, I have not read that
Oh
volume.
gosh, that's beautiful.
Mm-hmm.
You're, you would love that. But there's a passage where Keats, they're on a boat. He's headed to Italy, right? He's not doing well. And his friend, I forget who it was again, who was with him. Um, but Hayden, I think, uh,
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
was reading Don Juan, and Keats at a certain point threw the book down because he said that Byron was basically trying to invert to make uh like I forget the expression he used, but like to make like gay things sad and sad things gay. Like there was a scene of with cannibalism in it and a shipwreck, and Biden was sort of treating it very lightly as a kind of, again, it's a satirical poem, but Keats thought that was kind of yeah, it lacked the kind of um the moral dimension that a one would hope poetry could offer, since it was lacking in so many other places in society. And yet, yeah, basically Biden was inverting everything by using poetry to sort of poke fun of things that it were not exactly should not be poked fun at. I do remember that. I'm sort of giving a very not the best description here, but yeah, all that to say, what you're saying about Keats feeling there was a need to harken back to a better age, and given all the adversity he faced and the kind of the corruption of the literary establishment of his day, um, that's very fascinating. I feel like that's the Hyperion is an interesting link or bridge, perhaps, to how we can think about, yeah, bridging that gap with the ancient world.
And you know, David, if I had a wish list to offer, I wish that we would have an epic poem today. I think that we would benefit from a good epic today. American history is ripe ground for epic poetry. The story of America, the pioneers going west, creating a nation. That's the stuff of epic poetry, and I think that our history would be graced significantly if someone would write an epic poem today.
Right. And I mean, we have talked about this on the show before. And as somebody is, Michael Yost volunteered to write an essay on the question of epics, modern epics. And I mean, because I had raised the question in our discussion, and he did make the point, and I mean, it's kind of obvious. Yeah, there have been contemporary and modern epics, right? Leaves of Grass, Pounds Cantos. They're technically epics, but yet they don't seem to satisfy that you know that thing that we're all longing for when we think of the classic epics. So yeah, I think the question still stands, can there be a classic epic today? And why not? And yeah, what theme would that treat? It's I feel like it's a worthwhile and fascinating question.
Yes, I feel the same. Mm-hmm.
Why don't you so just so we're gonna link to all sorts of stuff. Maybe let's read some of your poetry now. I think now's a good time because we could again, I could throw all sorts of questions at you. We could turn this into a whole things, but yeah, I do need to I want to control myself a little bit. So yeah, you sent some poems here. Yeah, why don't you read us something? What would you like to maybe share first?
All right. In addition to translating Greek, I've also done some Latin translations. And I've taken a liking to the poet, the late Roman poet, Claudian.
Hmm.
He was the last, in my opinion, the last poet of the classical tradition. He lived around 400 AD, wrote shortly before the fall of the Roman Empire. One of the best. He had a wonderful poetic style and wrote about the Greek legends in a time when Christianity was the dominant force. He wrote great poems, but he's almost unknown today. And so I've looked over his poems in Latin and picked a few that I really liked and translated them. This is one of them. It's a poem about a man in the Italian city of Verona who spent his entire life on his farm and never saw the world.
Yeah.
It's called On an Old Man of Verona Who Never Left His Farm. Lucky old man who spends his days among fields he owns, whose boyhood house is roofed to his gray hairs, who leaning with cane on the soil of his first footsteps, looks on farmland the long years have not changed. No unforeseen misfortunes stormed his head with sorrow. He never tasted the river far from home. No merchant, no soldier to quake at breakers, at the trumpet, no plaintiff buffeted in the raucous forum. Guiltless of the world, even of his neighboring towns, he searches the sky's blue with a carefree eye. Names of crops, not of consuls, are his calendar. Autumn is apple picking, spring opening flowers. His same fields daily send up and receive the sun. Each day, hourly, provides its routine chores. That tall oak, he tells, was an acorn in his pocket. That orchard, he says, and he grew up together. Verona, it might be farther off than sun-baked India. Lake Garda, I might be talking of the Red Sea. Yet his handshake is firm and friendly. His grandchildren hang on his muscled arms like two stout boughs. Trudge, restless traveler, to the sea cliffs of remote Iberia. You journey, seeking life. He, tending his hearth, found it.
Hmm. That's very nice. And I've never even heard of any of Claudian's poetry. And yes, this has a nice pathos to it. It's beautiful.
Well, thank you.
Beautiful, Carey.
Mm-hmm.
So Claudian has a lot of poetry. There's a lot more that we can discover from this guy, correct?
Yes, in fact, if you look at the list of Antigone articles, the article right before my Philoctetes article was about Claudian.
Oh,
Um,
really? Okay. Okay, so we're gonna link to that. I didn't know. Okay.
so check that out.
And okay, so yeah, read us more. Now we're on the poetry train.
Okay, there's a snippet of my autobiography I didn't cover with you before. I guess I was unscrupulous in a way about my education. When I got my law degree, I thought, well, am I just going to go into some firm in some local city and just become a member of a commonplace firm? I thought, well, what else can I do with my law degree? Okay, here's what I did. I applied to be an Army legal officer. I applied to be an officer, a captain in the Judge Advocate General Corps, U.S. Army. And I was able to finagle getting an assignment to a military base in Mannheim, Germany. I spent 3 years in Mannheim, Germany. I couldn't have chosen a better city. Strictly luck, but I couldn't have chosen better. Mannheim is one of the cultural centers of Germany. It's where Schiller made his breakthrough as a playwright with his first play, The Robbers. It has
Okay.
a long, it has a long artistic tradition. You and I have discussed that previously. It had the best orchestra in Europe in the late 18th century. Mozart lived in Mannheim 6 months trying to find a job, wrote a lot of music while he was there. So it was a great place to spend 3 years. And during that time, I was able to, in addition to my military legal duties, I was able to see all sorts of sites and to immerse myself in European culture. Um, Basically, what I did was I took the grand tour. You know, that was a habit among wealthier people in the English speaking world. After they finished their formal education, they would take the grand tour of Europe.
Okay.
So as a, you know, due to my unscrupulous efforts, I was able to get a grand tour of Europe at the conclusion of my law school years. I spent 3 wonderful years in Europe, and that was very important for me um, to evolve as a person. But the poem I'm going to read is my impressions when I first arrived in Germany. When I first landed at the airport and took a train to my duty station in Mannheim. I'd never been overseas before. And so I tried to write a poem about the experiences of a young soldier who suddenly finds himself in a foreign land. Well, the poem is titled In Country. The conductor's whistle, an answering squeal as the train's wheels jolt, a quickening hiss as milling infernal crowds in the cavernous Hauptbahnhof fall away to the dull sheens of Frankfurt, the gray-green mine, the cindery, static, mizzling slate of a German sky. Being American is part of my baggage. Even before I greet cabin mates with a botched phrasebook sentence and sit, my tonsured scalp, baby pink GI face draw stares or nods of boreal politeness. I hunker, arms locked, a deaf mute, into my cushion. Like a film screen, fleeting scenery at my shoulder offers bittersweet refuge out of and into heaviness. Miniature, pastel, red tile roofed cottages, bikers on beach lanes, pastures neat as quilts under a skyline of blue hills, like Tennessee's, flash by. What a poor guesser the mind is. Where is the Germany of the daydream? Dirndled village folk dancing in the half-timbered marktplatz, horn-echoing woodlands of Wagner, Goethe, the generous country of the tinted postcard that somehow, oh, inevitable appetite, which makes the dissatisfied put dreamage to the proof, enlisted a fleecy adolescent indolence to board northeasterly gusting winds and report for duty where the Neckar feeds the Rhine. Today, I must confront impermeable bedrock. The conductor, grunting, punches my ticket.
Hmm. Fun. A travel, a travel poem. That's fun.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and so you did get to because I'm thinking of another poem that we published by you, which will also link to about your experience at the opera. And so I'm seeing a theme. You frequented the opera a fair
That was
bit.
yes, that was a performance of Wagner's opera Lohengrin that I attended at the National Theater, which is the same theater historically where Schiller's play was premiered.
Wow, that's fascinating. Have you translated any or any is German in your skill set of languages? Have you ever done I mean you don't actually need to know it to translate, right? There are so many translations. Have you translated any German?
No, I haven't. I never really got beyond the conversational level. Now, Now, I will say that even with a conversational level of German, it's very easy to read the 18th century German lyricists. I'll pick Goethe as an example. His poetry is very easy to understand. It's written almost as folk poetry,
Right.
I've read a lot of Goethe in the original.
Right. And yeah, I mean, and that is refreshing, right? When you read Goethe, I mean, he's brilliant. And yet what's so brilliant though is the way that he, develops his poetical ideas. And the language is still very accessible. I'm not even conversational in German technically, but I have a lot of experience, whether it's like singing German songs or just reading with translations by my side and then working out my own, being familiar with the music of the language and how it kind of works. I feel that allows me to appreciate the original German, right? Because there's a German has a bit of there's a whipping and there's a crunchiness to it. It's, nicht. And you can see how the punchlines coming, right? And the turns. The German is very transparent like that. And so when I translate German, I want to capture all these elements, which I know are fundamental to the compositional unfolding of the idea. So yeah, German is a fascinating language, and of course the culture is so rich, right? So
Right.
I'm not surprised that you were writing poems about your experiences with German culture and the German nation. Uh More. I'm let's hear more, Carey. I'm interested. Um you have another uh
Well, I could read a third poem, and this is one that you've honored me by publishing in the Chained Muse, the Desktop Muse.
okay.
It's a strophic poem of mine that you published about a year ago. Just a little bit of background. It's keeping with the classical theme. It's a poem about a statuette of a Greek goddess that I've been keeping on my top shelf of my desk as an inspiration, as my muse.
Okay, and
Um,
well, I
I
guess
came upon. Go ahead.
I guess we'll discover which goddess it is in the poem.
Um, I'm not going to reveal her identity.
Okay,
And
okay,
that would be a breach of trust, I think, and it might affect my future poetry.
okay,
Um,
okay. Mysterious. All right, mystery. Okay, a mystery
but
always.
let me just read the poem. Yeah, it's titled "The Desktop Muse." Um, the dealer droned on despite my frown. Then I noticed her, hunched and gravel, kept on a cluttered shop floor long unswept. Greek beauty callously marked down. Suffering divinity looked on me then. Her iced eyes thawed to sparkling when I cleansed her brow with religious care and placed her to reign on my desktop. There, her sunlit face shines coldly bright, a Mona Lisa in sculpted white. But under a cloud crossed moon by night, she dances in waves of milky light. Lunar passions her morning features hide, yet the smile dawning over my midnight phrase, as if love, for a mind still trapped inside, devolves like grace on one who prays.
Beautiful, beautiful. And there's something about this. It's
Thank
desktop
you.
muse that it almost it sounds counterintuitive as far as a poetic subject, like a desktop muse, really. Like I'm thinking like a computer, a desk, right? It's a like desk computer at my desktop. And yet I feel there's a charm to it that you manage to awaken a deeper felt passion from something that, from something that's a borderline trinket, technically. right? If we're
Hmm.
talking
Hmm.
desktop statuette. So
Yes.
yeah, this isn't the grandiose, you know, Hope Dionysus or something that stands at like 6 feet 7 or something, or Hermes. It's a little statuette, and yet there's that a beautiful sort of poetic inspiration that it yet manages to kindle. So there's something very charming about that I like.
David, if it won't overextend my welcome, I'd like to squeeze in one more.
Yeah, sure. No,
A, a,
we're on the poetry train at this point. So
a quick one. I've written a lot of sonnets, and I wanted to read one of my sonnets.
sure.
This one is a poetic tribute to a wooden puppet that a friend of mine took to a party one time, and it became the center of the conversation.
Okay.
And don't ask me how it happened. Things happened. And she asked me to write a poetic tribute to the wooden puppet. And I thought, well, who wrote very formal poems in praise of certain people? John Milton did, for example. He wrote a lot of poems praising people. So I thought I would make it in the style of John Milton. So it's titled Miltonic Sonnet to a Wooden Puppet. And the puppet's name was Bob. Bob, whose forefathers, stout limbed and deep rooted, clothed the white Alps or Taiwan's jungled hills, born when with dusty noise of screws and drills, torso and limbs were deftly constituted. Your social acumen is undisputed. For once, I hear, the conversation slowed, till you being theme, it briskly overflowed. And if you didn't save that party, who did? Your wooden rigor touches us like fire. We know of those who, with the flawless stroke, master what some spend lifeblood to acquire. That festive elegance which with sure flair sweeps past poor bumblers lacking tale or joke. They also socialize who sit and stare.
Hmm. That's fun. A
Mm-hmm.
little
Of
a
course,
poem about a conversation piece. There's nothing like a good conversation piece, right? That's
right. And of course, that last line, they also socialize who sit and stare, was a take on Milton's line, they also serve who only stand and wait.
hmm,
Mm-hmm.
interesting. No,
Yes.
that's very
Mm-hmm.
fun. Very fun, Carey. I mean, you've got a lively, you've got a great imagination, and it's nice to see that you have, as we've said, kept your passion alive, and I feel like it's only growing, right? And now you're retired, right? So you're no longer rendering verdicts on people's social security eligibility, but on
Correct.
classical Greek tragedians and the fate or the conclusions of their lost tragedies.
Here's how I look at it, David. I'm taking the road not taken. I'm going back and looking for that road that Frost passed, and I'm trying to take it.
That's beautiful, Carrie, and I think that's a beautiful note to end it on for all our listeners. So I'm going to thank you once again, Carrie, for joining us. We're going to be linking to all your stuff below the post, and I look forward to hearing from you again sometime soon.
Well, let's do a sequel.
All right. So thank you very much, Carrie. Thank you everyone for listening, and we'll be back next week.
All right. Thank you very much, David.